The desert wind, carrying the grit of Afghanistan, was a familiar and bitter companion for Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne. For 15 years, that wind had been the backdrop to his life, a life defined by controlled chaos, brotherhood, and the sacred duty of a Navy SEAL medic. He moved through the forward operating base with the quiet economy of motion that came from years of operating in the world's most dangerous places. His body was a road map of healed breaks and faded scars, each one a story he never told. The deepest wounds, however, were the ones etched into his soul, the ones that made his blue eyes look perpetually haunted. He was on his way to the small base chapel, a repurposed shipping container with a simple wooden cross. He wasn't a religious man, not in the traditional sense, but the chapel was the only place he could find a few moments of silence, a few moments where the weight of his responsibilities, the men he'd saved, and the men he hadn't, didn't press down on his chest like a 10-ton bomb. He needed to be alone with the ghosts before the next mission brief. As he walked, the sharp, distinctive crackle of small arms fire erupted from the direction of the main gate. It was a sound that bypassed his ears and went straight to his central nervous system. In an instant, the weary sailor was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating machine that was Operator Thorne. His body flooded with adrenaline, his senses sharpening to a razor's edge. He was already sprinting, his medical kit thumping against his hip, before the echo of the first shot had faded. The scene at the gate was controlled chaos. A local national convoy had been targeted by a drive-by shooter. Afghan soldiers and a few American troops were already securing the perimeter, their voices sharp and urgent. Marcus's eyes swept the area, a medic's triage assessment happening in a fraction of a second. Then he saw the downed men, 2 Afghan interpreters clutching wounds, an American soldier being helped to a nearby Humvee. He was moving towards them when a voice, taut with tension, cut through the air. "Doc, we need you over here!" It was one of his own, a young SEAL from his troop, gesturing frantically towards a figure slumped against a concrete barrier. Marcus pivoted, his heart lurching. He expected to see one of his brothers. He sprinted over, his mind already cycling through trauma protocols. But as he slid to his knees in the gravel, the world seemed to stop. It wasn't a SEAL. It wasn't a man at all. It was a woman, an American soldier. Her helmet had been knocked off, and a fan of dark, sweat-soaked hair was plastered to her forehead. A patch of crimson was already blossoming on the shoulder of her uniform. But it wasn't her face, pale and contorted with pain, that stole the air from Marcus's lungs. It was the emblem on the shoulder of her uniform, a shield, a rattlesnake, the words U.S. Army arcing above it, the patch of the 3rd Infantry Division. For a single terrifying heartbeat, Marcus was no longer in Afghanistan. The gritty base, the smell of cordite, the shouts of men, it all vanished. He was back in a sun-drenched living room in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 17 years old, staring at a photograph on a mantelpiece. It was a picture of his older brother, Ryan, and beaming in his crisp dress uniform, the same Rock of the Marne patch stark against his shoulder, the day he'd left for his first deployment to Iraq, the day Marcus had never seen him again. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, the look on his mother's face when the 2 soldiers in their dress blues had appeared at their front door, the flag they had folded with such solemn precision, the casket draped in the same colors, the brother who had taught him to throw a baseball, as who had promised to be his best man, was gone, swallowed by the same world of dust and violence that now swirled around them. The young SEAL who had called him over was staring. "Doc! Doc! She's bleeding out, man!" The voice was a lifeline, yanking Marcus back from the precipice of his own memories. He blinked, and the ghost of his brother faded, replaced by the very real, very wounded woman in front of him. The emblem was no longer a symbol of his family's deepest wound, but a simple identifier. She was a soldier, an American, a person whose life was literally in his hands. He shook his head, physically dispelling the fog. "I'm on it," he growled, his voice rough. His hands, which had trembled for a fraction of a second, became perfectly steady. He had a job to do. It was the only thing he knew how to do. He leaned over her, blocking the sun with his body. "Hey, soldier. My name's Marcus. I'm a medic. You're going to be just fine. Do you understand me? You're going to be just fine." He didn't know if he was saying it for her or for himself. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, fluttered open and found his. They were filled with pain, but also a fierce, defiant spark. She tried to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. "Don't talk," he commanded, his voice softening slightly. "Save your energy. Just keep looking at me. Right here. Focus on my voice." As he spoke, his hands were already at work, a dance of practiced precision. He pulled out his trauma shears and sliced through the sleeve of her uniform, exposing the wound. A bullet had punched a clean hole through her deltoid. The bleeding was heavy, but it hadn't hit the major artery. He could work with this. He packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, the material designed to stop bleeding instantly. The pressure made her gasp and try to pull away. I know," he murmured, his voice a low, steady hum against the chaos. "It hurts like hell. But you're tougher than this, right? You're a Marn dog. You don't quit." The words came out before he could stop them. It was the nickname his brother had used for his unit. The name was a knife in his gut, but he forced himself to stay present. He caught the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She tried to speak again, her voice a weak rasp. How did you—" He didn't answer. He just gave her a tight, humorless smile and continued his work, wrapping the wound with a pressure bandage, and his movements fluid and sure. The sounds of the firefight were dying down. The threat was over. But for Marcus, a new and far more personal battle had just begun. The emblem on her shoulder had ripped open a scar he thought had healed over long ago, and the woman on the ground, this stranger with her brother's patch, was now standing in the middle of it. In the following days, the image of her face, pale against the desert camouflage, haunted Marcus more than any combat memory ever had. He threw himself into his work, running training drills until his men were exhausted, checking and rechecking medical supplies, volunteering for every patrol. He was trying to outrun a ghost, but the ghost wore a familiar patch. He hadn't learned her name. He hadn't wanted to. Knowing her name would make her real, would make the connection to Ryan more concrete. It was easier to think of her as just another casualty, another successful treatment in a long line of them. 2 weeks later, he was sitting in the chow hall pushing a tasteless pile of food around his tray when a figure stopped at the end of his table. He looked up. It was her. Her arm was in a sling, but she was on her feet, her green eyes clear and bright. She was holding a cup of coffee in her good hand. "Mind if I sit down?" she asked. Her voice was stronger now, with a slight southern drawl. Marcus just shrugged, a non-committal gesture that he hoped would convey disinterest. He was a SEAL, and he operated in the shadows. He didn't make small talk with soldiers, especially not ones who were walking embodiments of his personal trauma. She sat down anyway. "I'm Lieutenant Sofia Ramirez," she said, extending her hand. After a beat, Marcus shook it. His grip was firm, his hand calloused. "I wanted to thank you, properly. The docs at the hospital said if it hadn't been for the quick work on the ground, I would have lost a lot more blood. I might have lost the arm altogether." "It's my job," Marcus said flatly, returning his gaze to his tray. The words sounded hollow and rude, even to his own ears. Sophia didn't flinch. She had dealt with plenty of stoic, hardened men in her time. She took a sip of her coffee and studied him. He was older than the other SEALs she'd seen, with lines around his eyes that spoke of more than just age. He had the look of a man who had seen too much. "Still," she persisted gently, "it's not every day a Navy SEAL medic stops to patch up an Army lieutenant. I'm grateful, so thank you." He finally looked at her, his gaze landing on the patch on her good shoulder. The rattlesnake, the shield. The question that had been burning in him since that day slipped out before he could stop it. "How long have you been with the 3rd ID?" She seemed surprised by the personal question. "A little over 2 years. My first deployment was with them." "Why?" Marcus shook his head slowly, in his jaw tight. "No reason." Sophia was smart. She was an intelligence officer, after all. She had seen the way his eyes had lingered on her uniform, the flash of something raw and painful that had crossed his face when he'd first treated her. It wasn't the look a medic gives a patient. It was something far more personal. "It's not just a patch to you, is it?" she asked quietly. It wasn't really a question. The directness of it caught him off guard. He met her gaze, and for a moment, in the walls he had so carefully constructed seemed to crack. He saw not just a soldier in front of him, but a person with a family, a life, a story, just like Ryan had been. He looked away, out the dusty window at the barren landscape. "My brother," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. He was a Marne dog, KIA in Ramadi, 2005. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Sophia's expression softened, the professional curiosity replaced by genuine empathy. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. The words were simple, but they were offered with a sincerity that was impossible to dismiss. Marcus just gave a short, sharp nod. He couldn't trust his voice. The simple act of saying it out loud to a stranger had unleashed a wave of emotion he had been suppressing for years. He had expected pity, perhaps, or the awkward silence that often followed such a revelation. But Sophia simply sat with him in the quiet, offering no platitudes, no empty words. She just took another sip of her coffee, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his memories. Finally, she spoke again, her voice light, deliberately steering them away from the heavy waters they had just entered. "So you're a SEAL medic. That means you're basically a doctor who can also kick down doors and clear a room, right?" The unexpected question, the hint of a smile on her lips, broke the tension. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his own mouth. "Yeah, something like that," he admitted. And in that small moment a bridge was built. The chasm of loss and guilt that had separated him from the world for so long had, for the first time, a fragile span across it. Sophia didn't represent the wound anymore. She was becoming a person who, by simply being present and unafraid of his pain, was starting to help him heal it. Over the next few weeks, their encounters became a quiet routine. A nod across the crowded chow hall. A brief conversation at the small base gym. A shared cup of terrible coffee in the early morning hours when the world was still and quiet. Sophia, with her sharp wit and relentless optimism, was like a persistent ray of sunshine trying to penetrate the perpetual gloom that surrounded Marcus. She didn't push him for details about his brother or his past. Instead, she talked about her own life. She told him about her family in Texas, her younger sister who was a rodeo barrel racer, or her abuela who made the best tamales in San Antonio. She spoke about her passion for her job, the puzzle of intelligence gathering, the feeling of making a difference, however small. She was vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the muted world Marcus inhabited. He found himself listening, actually listening, for the first time in years. He started to notice things again. The way the morning light caught the dust motes in the air, the surprising sweetness of the coffee she always brought him, and the sound of her laughter, which was genuine and full. It was a foreign, almost forgotten sound in that place. her presence